In 1670, in a small Puritan town called Boston, a woman walked into a government office and asked for something nobody had ever asked for before: permission to sell coffee. She was not a merchant. She was not wealthy. Her husband was often away for months at a time, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that expected women to stay quiet and dependent. Instead, she built a business. Her name was Dorothy Jones, and this is the strange, true story of how one woman started America's relationship with coffee 300 years before Starbucks ever existed. In the year 1670, in the small Puritan town of Boston, a woman named Dorothy Jones walked into a government office and asked for permission to sell coffee. This might sound like a small thing, a license to sell a drink, but it was the first time in American history that anyone had asked for such a thing. And it was granted to a woman, in a world where women were rarely allowed to run their own businesses at all. This is her story, and the story of how coffee first found its way into American life. To understand why this moment mattered, we need to picture Boston in 1670. It was not yet a city in the modern sense. It was a small colonial town, built by English Puritans who had crossed the ocean about 40 years earlier to build a religious community based on strict moral codes. Life in Boston revolved around church attendance, hard work, and a deep suspicion of anything that looked like idle pleasure. Taverns existed, but they were closely regulated. The town wanted to know who was selling what and to whom. At the same time, across the ocean in England, something new was happening. Coffee had arrived in London in the early 1650s, and within 20 years, the city had thousands of coffee houses. These were places where men gathered to talk about business, politics, and news. They were noisy, informal, and open to almost anyone who could pay a small fee for a cup. In England, coffee houses were sometimes called penny universities because for the price of a penny, a person could sit for hours and listen to educated conversation. Boston's colonists were still English at heart. Even though they lived an ocean away, they watched trends in London closely, and they wanted some of that same culture in their own town. But coffee itself was still rare in the colonies. It had not yet built its own history there. Someone needed to be first. That person turned out to be Dorothy Jones. Not much is known about Dorothy Jones's early life, and what we do know comes mostly from town records rather than personal letters or diaries. She was originally from Wales, and at some point she crossed the Atlantic to Massachusetts. Like most colonial records of ordinary people, especially women, the details are thin. We don't have a birth date carved in stone, or a portrait, or a diary describing her thoughts. What we have instead is a name in an official record, and the shape of a life we can reconstruct around it. Dorothy was married to a man named Morgan Jones. Morgan Jones was a minister and a schoolteacher, and his work took him from place to place across the colonies. He was not a man who stayed in one location for long. His job as a traveling minister and teacher meant that he was often away from home, moving between different settlements to preach or to teach. This meant that Dorothy Jones was frequently left on her own, responsible for supporting herself and likely her household, without her husband present to help. In a Puritan colonial world, this was not an easy position to be in. Women were expected to be dependent on husbands or fathers. They were not generally seen as capable of running independent businesses. Property law favored men. Social custom favored men. And yet Dorothy Jones needed a way to make a living, and she found one. In 1670, she applied to the town of Boston for a license. This was not unusual in itself. Colonial towns required licenses for the sale of goods like alcohol, and coffee fell into a similar category of regulated refreshment. What was unusual was that the license was granted to a woman, and that it was for a drink almost nobody in the colonies had ever tasted. The official record of her license still survives, and it reads, in the language of the time, that Mrs. Dorothy Jones, the wife of Mr. Morgan Jones, was approved to keep a house of public entertainment for the selling of coffee and chocolate. The old spelling used for chocolate at the time was cioccolato, or sometimes cuccioletto, reflecting how new and foreign the word still sounded to English ears. This document is often cited as the very first written reference to coffee anywhere in the Massachusetts colony. Before this piece of paper, There is no clear record of coffee being sold, taxed, or licensed in the region at all. Dorothy Jones did not just sell coffee. She created the first official paper trail proving that coffee had entered American commercial life. It's worth pausing on what this license actually allowed her to do. She was permitted to keep what the records called a house of public entertainment. This did not mean entertainment in the modern sense of shows or performances. It meant a place where members of the public could gather, sit, eat, and drink. In colonial New England, licensed houses like this operated similarly to taverns, though on a smaller and more modest scale than the grand coffee houses that would come later. We don't know exactly what her establishment looked like. It's likely it was based out of her own home, a common practice at the time for women running small businesses. She probably served coffee and chocolate alongside other refreshments that a household might offer, since dedicated coffee houses as separate buildings had not yet appeared in Boston. That would come a few years later. We also don't know exactly how she prepared the coffee she sold. Coffee at the time typically arrived as green, unroasted beans, which had to be roasted and ground by hand before brewing. It's likely that Dorothy Jones, or someone working for her, roasted the beans herself using whatever tools a colonial household had available, since dedicated coffee roasting equipment did not yet exist in the colonies. This would have been slow, smoky, and labor-intensive work, nothing like the instant process we associate with coffee today. Chocolate, which she was also licensed to sell, followed a similarly involved process. It arrived as solid cacao, which had to be ground down and mixed with hot water or milk, along with sugar or spices, to create a drink. Both coffee and chocolate, at this point in history, were treated less like food and more like medicine or luxury tonics, believed by some to aid digestion or improve the spirits. It is important to understand just how new both of these drinks were to English colonists in 1670. Coffee had only been introduced into England itself about 20 years earlier. Chocolate had arrived in Europe slightly earlier, brought over from the Spanish colonies in Central America, where cacao had been cultivated and consumed for centuries by indigenous peoples long before European contact. By the time these drinks reached a small town like Boston, they had already traveled across oceans, through European trade networks, and finally into the hands of colonists eager to copy the fashionable habits of London. Boston in 1670 was a town caught between two identities. On one hand, it was a strict religious settlement, founded by people who had crossed an ocean specifically to escape what they saw as corruption and excess in the Church of England. On the other hand, it was still deeply connected to English culture, English fashion, and English consumer habits. Coffee was part of that connection. It represented sophistication, modernity, and a link back to the world its residents had left behind. Dorothy Jones's business, then, sat at an interesting crossroads. She was selling a fashionable, modern, imported drink in a town that prized simplicity and modesty. She was a woman running a business in a town that generally expected women to remain in the domestic sphere. And she was doing all of this while her husband was frequently absent, tending to his own work as a traveling minister. Some later historians have pointed to Dorothy Jones as an early example of a woman using an unconventional path to economic independence. At a time when property law heavily favored men, and when women who ran businesses were often widows continuing a husband's trade rather than starting something of their own, Dorothy Jones petitioned for a license in her own right and received one. She was, in a very real sense, one of the first documented coffee traders in the record of American commerce, ahead of any man in the colony. It's worth noting that Dorothy Jones was not the only woman involved in Boston's early coffee trade. In the years following her license, other women also received permission to sell coffee and related goods. A woman named Jane Barnard, who already held a tavern license, was later permitted to add coffee and cider to what she could sell. Another woman, Mary Gutteridge, would go on to become a significant figure in Boston's early coffeehouse scene decades later, eventually becoming the full owner of one of the town's early coffeehouses. Taken together, these women formed a small but notable pattern. In its earliest years, The American coffee trade in New England was shaped substantially by women working to support themselves and their families. Dorothy Jones's license in 1670 came several years before Boston had anything resembling a formal, standalone coffee house. That milestone came in October of 1676, when a man named John Sparry was approved by the town selectmen to keep what the records describe as a public house for the selling of coffee. Some historians consider Sparry's establishment to be the first true coffee house in the American colonies, distinct from a household simply licensed to sell the drink alongside other goods. Others argue that Dorothy Jones deserves the earlier claim, since she was selling coffee commercially 6 years before Sparry opened his doors. This is actually a point of ongoing debate among historians who study early American coffee culture. Some give Dorothy Jones the title of first coffee trader in the colonies. Others reserve the title of first coffee house specifically for John Sparry, since his establishment appears to have been a dedicated space built around the drink itself, rather than one item among several sold at a private home. Both views can be true at once. Dorothy Jones was almost certainly the first person licensed to sell coffee in Massachusetts. John Sparry may have been the first to open a location built specifically around it. Either way, both events happened in Boston, within just a few years of each other, making the town the true starting point of American coffee culture. No other colonial settlement can point to an earlier claim. The next major milestone came in 1689, when the London Coffee House opened in Boston. As its name suggests, it was modeled directly on the coffee houses of the English capital, aiming to bring that same atmosphere of business, gossip, and political discussion to colonial New England. This coffee house would go on to have a long and interesting life of its own. Decades later, after the American Revolution, and with English names falling out of favor, the London Coffee House was renamed the American Coffee House, a small but symbolic shift reflecting the new nation's break from its former identity. By the early 1700s, coffee houses had become a fixture of Boston life. They served as meeting places for merchants conducting trade, for political groups organizing opposition to British policy, and for ordinary residents simply looking for company and conversation. One of the most famous of these later coffee houses was the Green Dragon, which would go on to host meetings of secret political groups in the years leading up to the American Revolution. Some accounts describe organizations like the Sons of Liberty gathering within its walls, discussing resistance to British taxation and rule. It's often said, somewhat poetically, that the Boston Tea Party itself may have been planned, at least in part, inside a Boston coffee house. There's a kind of quiet irony worth pointing out here. The Boston Tea Party was fundamentally a protest about tea. Colonists dressed as indigenous people boarded British ships and dumped chests of tea into the harbor, rejecting a tax imposed by a parliament they had no voice in. In the years that followed, drinking tea became associated with loyalty to the British Crown, while drinking coffee became associated with American independence and patriotism. If that shift in cultural meaning was already forming, even in a small way, then places like the coffee houses that grew out of Dorothy Jones's early efforts may have played a quiet role in shaping how colonists thought about their own identity, decades before independence was even a realistic goal. Of course, none of this was visible to Dorothy Jones in 1670. She was not thinking about revolutions or new nations. She was thinking about supporting herself and her household while her husband traveled from town to town for his work as minister and teacher. Her decision to apply for a coffee license was almost certainly a practical one, not a grand or symbolic one. She saw an opportunity, a new and fashionable product that English colonists wanted, and she found a way to be the person who provided it. It's easy, looking back from today, to romanticize figures like Dorothy Jones, to imagine her as a bold pioneer consciously breaking barriers for women in business. The historical truth is likely more modest and, in some ways, more relatable. She was a woman managing the practical difficulties of daily life, finding a legal and reasonably respectable way to earn income, in a system that offered very few paths for women to do so independently. That she happened to choose coffee, a drink that would go on to become one of the most consumed beverages in the world, is partly a matter of historical timing and coincidence. And yet, timing matters. because she happened to be the person who filed for that license in 1670. Her name is preserved in the written record, connected forever to the first documented coffee trade in what would eventually become the United States. Millions of people who have never heard her name have still, in some very small and indirect way, inherited a piece of the world she helped begin. Every coffee shop on every American street corner today exists within a tradition whose earliest recorded thread runs back to a Welsh immigrant woman in Puritan Boston, filling out paperwork to sell a strange new imported drink out of her home. There is something worth sitting with in that thought. History is often remembered through its most dramatic events, its wars, its declarations, its famous speeches. But it is also built quietly through small licenses, small business decisions, and small acts of practical survival by ordinary people whose full stories were never written down. Dorothy Jones left behind no memoir, no portrait, no detailed account of her daily life. She left behind a single line in a town record, describing a license granted for the selling of coffee and chocolate. From that single line, we can reconstruct a woman navigating a difficult world, finding independence where she could, and, without knowing it, opening the very first page in the long story of American coffee culture. Boston would go on to build an entire identity around its coffee houses. They became stages for revolution, for commerce, for community. Some, like the Exchange Coffee House built in the early 1800s, grew into massive, multi-story buildings that functioned almost like small cities under one roof, housing trading floors, hotel rooms, and public meeting spaces all at once. Others remained small and modest, serving their neighborhoods quietly for decades. But all of them, in one way or another, trace their lineage back to that first license granted in 1670. Today, when we think about the history of American coffee, we tend to picture much later chapters. We think of Starbucks opening its first store in Seattle in 1971. We think of the rise of specialty coffee shops in the late 20th century, or the growth of massive coffee chains stretching across every American town and city. These are real and important parts of the story, but they all stand on a foundation laid centuries earlier by a woman whose name rarely appears in mainstream retellings of coffee's American history. Dorothy Jones deserves to be remembered as more than a footnote. She represents the earliest known moment when coffee entered American commercial life in a formal, documented way. She represents an early and unusual example of female economic independence in a colonial world that offered women very few such opportunities. And she represents the quiet, unglamorous, practical side of history, the side built not by kings or generals, but by ordinary people finding ways to get by, one license, one cup, one customer at a time. We don't know how Dorothy Jones's story ended. We don't know how long her business lasted, whether it thrived or struggled, or what became of her in her later years. The historical record, as is so often the case with ordinary people from this period, simply goes quiet. What remains is that single license, dated 1670, preserved in the town records of Boston, describing permission granted to a woman to sell coffee and chocolate to the public. It is a small piece of paper, but it marks the beginning of something enormous. From that modest starting point, in a small Puritan town on the edge of an unfamiliar continent, grew a culture of coffee houses, coffee shops, and coffee drinking that would eventually become one of the defining habits of American daily life. Every morning commute that begins with a cup of coffee, every meeting held over coffee, every coffee shop serving as a place for conversation, work, or simply a quiet moment alone, carries within it a thread that runs all the way back to Dorothy Jones, standing in front of Boston's town officials in 1670, asking for permission to sell a drink that almost nobody in the colonies had ever tasted before. That is the story of Dorothy Jones, the woman history remembers as the first person licensed to sell coffee in America.